Trump isn't just asking Egypt and Jordan to take refugees from Gaza. He's literally demanding it. This isn't a diplomatic request. This isn't a suggestion. It's an order.
King and Jordan have both said that they won't take in displaced people from Gaza like you suggested. Is there anything you can do to make them do that? I mean, tariffs against those countries, for example?
They will do it. They will do it.
What makes you say that?
They're going to do it. Okay? We do a lot for them, and they're going to do it.
So why is he doing this? Why is Trump so insistent on pushing 1.6 million people across borders? Is this really about offering humanitarian relief? Or is there something else happening behind the scenes? Well, let's hear it directly from the man himself.
I don't know how they could want to stay. It's a demolition site. It's a pure demolition site. If we could find the right piece of land or numerous pieces of land and build them some really nice places with plenty of money in the area, that's for sure, I think that would be a lot better than going back to Gaza, which has had just decades and decades of death.
Now, let's step back for a second, because there's something very strange about all of this. Why is the US, sitting thousands of miles away, suddenly pressuring other countries to absorb Palestinian refugees? And most importantly, why are those neighboring nations refusing to take them? I think looking at history can help us answer that second question. It will also tell us why there's no chance in hell that the king of Jordan will let Hamas into his country. But first, let's start with Egypt, a country that actually shares a border with Gaza. If anyone should be stepping in, it should be Egypt. That's the logical assumption. Gaza's closest ally, a Muslim-majority nation, and one that has spent decades positioning itself as the leader of the Arab world. So they should be the very first to offer humanitarian aid, shelter, or at the very least, a safe passage for refugees. But you'd be surprised to know that Egypt has done the exact opposite. Not only have they refused to take Palestinians, but they've actively made sure that they can't get in. They've heavily reinforced the Rafah border, added more security, and even issued standing orders for their border forces to use lethal force if any Palestinian attempts to cross illegally. It doesn't matter if it's men, women, or children, the answer is always no. And it's not just about now. This is a pattern. Egypt has had a blockade on Gaza for years, keeping the border sealed tight. Even during past wars, when Israeli airstrikes turned entire neighborhoods into rubble, the border stayed closed. No asylum, no temporary shelters, nothing. And let's not forget Jordan. Unlike Egypt, Jordan doesn't even share a border with Gaza. Yet Trump is pushing them to take in refugees too. Why? Because Jordan already has a massive Palestinian population. Nearly half of its population is of Palestinian origin. And if history has shown us anything, it's that Jordan does not want another wave of Palestinian refugees flooding in. Last time they did that, it nearly tore the country apart. Usually, when war breaks out, civilians flee and neighboring countries step in to provide shelter. That's how it works in most refugee crises. When Ukraine was invaded, Poland and other European nations opened their doors overnight. When the Syrian war escalated, millions found refuge in Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon. But when it comes to Palestinians, no one is opening their doors. Not Egypt, not Jordan, not Saudi Arabia, not the UAE. But why is that? Why aren't the Palestinians welcomed in the very Arab nations that rally for their cause? In this video, we're breaking it all down. How this refugee crisis started, why Arab nations once welcomed Palestinians with open arms, and why those same nations later turned their backs on them. And if you think this is going to be the same one-sided narrative you hear everywhere else, think again. This isn't about pushing an agenda. This is history. This is what happened, told through the words and actions of the very nations that claim to stand with Palestine. So before we jump in, drop a like. It helps us push past the algorithm and get this information to more people. All right, now let's get into it. It all began in 1948 with an event that the Palestinians called the Al-Nakba, or the catastrophe. It was the moment everything changed. The moment hundreds of thousands of people lost their homes, their land, and in many cases, their future. But to really understand how this crisis began, we need to step back to the late 1940s, a time when the Middle East was already on the brink of war. After World War II, Jewish immigration to British-controlled Palestine had skyrocketed. The horrors of the Holocaust had intensified global support for a Jewish homeland, and Zionist movements had grown stronger, pushing for the creation of an independent Jewish state. But the Arabs of Palestine, who had lived on the land for centuries, weren't willing to just give it up. Tensions between Jewish and Arab communities had been boiling for decades, with both sides claiming historical and religious ties to the land. The British, who had been ruling Palestine under a League of Nations mandate since 1920, were caught in the middle. They couldn't control the violence. The situation was spiraling out of control, and they wanted out. So in 1947, they handed the issue over to the newly formed United Nations. And that's when the world made a decision that would change everything. The United Nations proposed a partition plan that would divide Palestine into two states, one for the Jews, one for the Arabs. And Jerusalem, the holy city, would remain international territory. For Zionist leaders, this was an opportunity they could not refuse. Even though the plan didn't give them all the land they actually wanted, they accepted it. For Palestinians and the Arab world, however, this was an insult. They saw the partition plan as a colonial land grab, one that took away their land and handed it to European Jewish settlers. The Arab world rejected it outright. They didn't want a compromise. They wanted all of Palestine. And so, when the Jewish leadership formally declared the establishment of the State of Israel on May 14, 1948, the Arab nations responded with war. Within hours of Israel declaring independence, 5 Arab nations invaded: Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. They all had one goal, and that was to wipe this newly formed state off the map before it could even stand on its own 2 feet. But the war didn't go as planned. Instead of crushing Israel, the Arab forces found themselves divided, uncoordinated, and outmaneuvered. The Israeli military, despite being outnumbered, fought with brutal efficiency, using weapons given to them by the British Empire, seizing more land than was originally allocated to them in the UN plan. By the time the war ended in 1949, Israel had not only survived, it had expanded its territory far beyond what the UN had proposed. And in the process, over 700,000 Palestinians had been displaced. As the war raged on, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians fled or were forced to leave. Some left because their towns became battlefields, caught in the crossfire between Israel and Arab forces. Others fled out of fear, terrified by massacres they'd heard about, like the infamous Deir Yassin massacre. But there was another factor, one that many people don't talk about. Arab leaders actually encouraged Palestinians to leave. Expecting a swift Arab victory, many Arab governments and military leaders told Palestinian civilians to evacuate temporarily, promising them that once the war was won, they would return home. But that victory never came. Instead, the war ended with Palestinians locked out of their homeland. By the time the war ended in 1949, Israel controlled far more land than was originally planned. And the Palestinian refugees who had fled found themselves stranded outside of what was now Israeli territory. They were stateless and trapped in limbo, unable to return to their homes, which were now either destroyed or occupied by Jewish immigrants. So where did they go? Well, they had nowhere to go except the neighboring Arab countries that had fought in the war on their behalf: Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, and Egypt. 4 nations that had fought against Israel now had to deal with the human cost of their defeat. But instead of standing united, each of these countries responded differently, shaping the Palestinian refugee crisis in ways no one had really expected. Of all the Arab nations, Jordan took the largest number of Palestinian refugees. And for a time, it did something no other Arab country was willing to do. It gave them citizenship. On the surface, it looked like an act of pure solidarity. By 1950, nearly 100,000 Palestinian refugees had entered Jordan. By the late 1960s, Palestinians made up nearly half of Jordan's population. Under King Abdullah I and later King Hussein, Jordan granted full citizenship to many Palestinian refugees, allowing them to work, move freely, and integrate into society. But Jordan's decision wasn't just about helping refugees. King Abdullah had a much bigger motive, one that was political, not humanitarian. You see, at the time, Jordan controlled the West Bank, and the West Bank was filled with Palestinians. By granting them citizenship, Abdullah was slowly strengthening Jordan's claim over that territory. He wanted the world to see the West Bank as a part of Jordan, not an independent Palestinian state. And for a while, this strategy worked. Many Palestinians settled into Jordanian cities like Amman and Zarqa, finding jobs, starting businesses, and rebuilding their lives. For the first time since 1948, they had some form of stability. But what had started as an act of goodwill quickly spiraled into a crisis that nearly collapsed the Jordanian monarchy itself. By the mid-1960s, something had changed. The Palestinian issue was no longer just a refugee crisis, it had become an armed resistance movement. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, led by Yasser Arafat, had emerged as the dominant political force among Palestinians. And while its leadership was based in exile, its fighters, especially those from Arafat's faction, Fatah, were building their power inside of Jordan. This wasn't just a humanitarian problem anymore. It was a direct challenge to the Jordanian government. But why? Why did the PLO take root in Jordan? And why did Palestinians, who had more rights in Jordan than anywhere else, turn to armed resistance? Well, the answer lies in two things. One is their identity, and the other is the failure of Arab leadership. Jordan may have given them citizenship, but to most Palestinians, it was just a piece of paper. They didn't see Jordan as their home. They saw themselves as exiles, living in temporary refuge until they could return to Palestine. Many still held on to deeds and the keys to their homes in Haifa, Jaffa, and other cities in what had become Israel. Their parents and grandparents had told them stories about the land they had lost, about the orchards, the markets, and the towns they would one day reclaim. In schools, in refugee camps, in their homes, everything revolved around one promise. One day, we will return. Jordanian citizenship didn't erase the loss of their homeland. If anything, it only made them more determined to fight for it. Now, the second reason. Palestinians had been depending on the Arab world for decades to help them reclaim their homeland. Those nations had promised them one thing, that they would win Palestine back for them. After their defeat in 1948, Arab rulers swore that the next war would be different. They assured Palestinian refugees that their exile was temporary, that Israel was just a mistake that would soon be undone. But the years kept passing. Israel grew, and nothing changed. By the early 1960s, Palestinians had lost faith in the Arab world. The leaders who had once promised them liberation were now more focused on their own survival. Egypt's Gamal Abdel Nasser, once the face of Arab resistance, was more concerned about his own influence in the region. Jordan and Saudi Arabia were too busy fighting off internal revolutions. Syria had gone through multiple coups, with each government too unstable to focus on Palestine. Palestinians, they were done waiting. They realized that if they wanted their land back, they had to take matters into their own hands. But there was still one problem. The Palestinian movement wasn't unified. It had no real leadership, no military structure, and no independent power. And that was about to change. In 1964, the Arab League, a coalition of Arab nations, officially created the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO. But at the time, the PLO was nothing more than a political tool controlled by Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser. The idea was simple. Give Palestinians a formal organization, but keep them under Arab leadership. The PLO wasn't a real resistance movement. It was an extension of Egyptian influence. But that changed when one man took control. That man was Yasser Arafat. Arafat wasn't a politician. He wasn't a king or a general. He was a Palestinian who had grown up in exile, watching his people struggle for decades. He had spent years organizing fighters outside the control of Arab governments, building his own independent movement called Fatah. Fatah had one core belief. Palestinians could no longer rely on Arab nations. The PLO had to become its own force, separate from Egypt, Jordan, or Syria. It had to be a Palestinian-led organization, not an Arab puppet. Arafat's moment came in 1968, after the Battle of Karama, the fight that changed everything. On March 21st, 1968, Israel launched Operation Inferno, a massive attack on a PLO stronghold in Karama, Jordan. They thought they could wipe out Arafat's forces. The battle was bloody and costly for both sides. The PLO, alongside Jordanian soldiers, fought back harder than anyone expected. By the end, both Israel and the PLO suffered heavy losses. But the fact that the PLO had resisted at all turned Arafat into a hero. To Palestinians, this was proof. They didn't need Arab armies. They could fight for themselves. And just like that, Arafat and Fatah took over the PLO. Under Arafat's leadership, the PLO transformed from a political body into a full-fledged military force. By the late 1960s, the PLO was no longer just a resistance movement. It was an armed government operating inside of Jordan, as if Jordanian law didn't apply to them, and why would they? At that point in time, the PLO had heavily armed and battle-trained fighters, massive stockpiles of weapons that were smuggled from Syria, Iraq, and the Soviet bloc, training camps where new recruits were prepared for guerrilla warfare, and their own police force that operated in Palestinian-majority areas. This wasn't just about fighting Israel anymore. The PLO had become a challenge to King Hussein himself. And that's what led to the breaking point. A moment where Jordan and the PLO could no longer exist side by side. The result? A full-scale war. The conflict known as Black September. The tensions between Jordan and the PLO had been building for years. But the final straw came on September 6th, 1970. That day, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, a radical faction within the PLO, had hijacked 4 commercial airliners flying over Europe. The planes, mostly operated by American and British Airlines, were full of Western passengers. 3 of them were redirected to Dawson's Field, a remote desert airstrip in Jordan. Hundreds of passengers were taken hostage. The PFLP demanded the release of Palestinian prisoners in exchange for the captives. The entire world was watching. For King Hussein, this was the breaking point. It wasn't just that Palestinian militias were hijacking planes, it was that they were doing it from Jordanian soil, turning his country into a launchpad for global terrorism. Jordan was no longer seen as an independent state, it was looking like a lawless territory where the PLO could do whatever it wanted. Then on September 12th, the PFLP escalated things even further. They blew up 3 of the hijacked planes right in front of the international media. The hostages had been removed, but the message was clear. Jordan had lost control. This was an insult King Hussein couldn't ignore. The very next day, he declared martial law and started preparing for the inevitable showdown. 4 days later, on September 16th, 1970, Jordan's military launched a full-scale assault on the PLO. Tanks rolled into Palestinian refugee camps and strongholds. Fighter jets bombed PLO bases. Street battles erupted in Amman, Eybpt, and other Palestinian majority areas. The Jordanian military, better trained and equipped, quickly overwhelmed the Palestinian fighters. The PLO was used to fighting guerrilla warfare, ambushes, and hit-and-run tactics against Israel. But this was different. Now they were facing a national army, backed by tanks and artillery in an all-out war. The PLO fought back hard. Palestinian fighters had spent years building networks inside of Jordanian cities, and in some places, they had more support from the population than the Jordanian army itself. But they were outgunned. The worst of the fighting happened in Amman, Jordan's capital. Within days, thousands of Palestinians lay dead. The PLO was losing, and they knew it. But then another player entered the fight, one that changed the course of the battle. As Jordanian forces crushed the PLO, Syria saw an opportunity. Now, officially, Syria claimed it was defending the Palestinian cause. But in reality, Hafez al-Assad, Syria's defense minister at the time, had a different plan. If Jordan collapsed, Syria could move in and take control. So on September 19th, the Syrian army invaded Jordan, sending nearly 200 tanks across the border. For a moment, it looked like King Hussein was doomed. But there's one thing Syria didn't count on. Jordan had a secret ally, Israel. Despite being enemies, Jordan and Israel had mutual interest, and that was in keeping the PLO out of power. If Jordan collapsed, Israel knew it would be dealing with a Palestinian-controlled Jordan, which is far worse than dealing with King Hussein. So behind the scenes, Israel sent a message to Syria that if they didn't stand down, then Israel would intervene. Syria, realizing that an Israeli military response was possible, backed off. The Syrian tanks retreated. With Syria out of the way, Jordan's military crushed the last remaining PLO strongholds, and by the end of September, the PLO was defeated. With his fighters dead, arrested, or on the run, Yasser Arafat had no choice but to flee. He and the surviving PLO leadership escaped to Lebanon, where they would regroup and rebuild their forces, this time in a country even more fragile than Jordan. You see, just like other Arab nations, Lebanon had taken in Palestinian refugees after the 1948 and 1967 wars. At first, it seemed like a temporary situation, a humanitarian gesture until Palestine was liberated. But as the years passed, the number of refugees grew. Tens of thousands became hundreds of thousands. And soon, the Palestinians weren't just a small, displaced population, they became a major demographic force in Lebanon. But unlike Jordan, which had given many Palestinians citizenship, Lebanon refused to integrate them in any way. On paper, Lebanon justified this by saying that granting Palestinians citizenship would undermine their right of return to Palestine. The argument was that if Palestinians were given Lebanese nationality, it would weaken their claim to their homeland and let Israel off the hook. But in reality, this was more about Lebanon politics than Palestinian rights. It was about preserving Lebanon's fragile sectarian balance. Lebanon's entire political system was based on a delicate religious power-sharing agreement. The president had to be a Maronite Christian, the prime minister had to be a Sunni Muslim, and the Speaker of Parliament had to be a Shia Muslim. This sectarian system was meant to prevent any one group from dominating the country, but it also made Lebanon extremely vulnerable to demographic changes. The arrival of hundreds of thousands of overwhelmingly Sunni Palestinian refugees was seen as a direct threat to this balance. If they were granted citizenship, it would tip the scales in favor of Sunni Muslims, something that Christians and Shia factions could never allow. To them, the Palestinians weren't just refugees. They were a potential political coup waiting to happen. Because of this, Palestinians in Lebanon were kept in a state of permanent limbo. Unlike in Jordan, where they could at least become part of the country, Lebanon completely cut them off from society. They weren't allowed to work in most professions, they weren't allowed to own property, and even basic government services like healthcare and education were largely off-limits to them. Instead, the majority of Palestinians were forced into refugee camps, which over time turned into overcrowded, lawless, and poverty-stricken ghettos. Camps like Sabra, Shatila, Ain el-Helwe, and Burj al-Barajna weren't just temporary shelters anymore. They became permanent slums, where generations of Palestinians were born, lived, and died with no real future. The Lebanese government refused to improve conditions, fearing that doing so would encourage them to stay permanently, and this fueled deep resentment, not just among the refugees, but also among ordinary Lebanese citizens. Many Lebanese viewed the Palestinians as an economic and social burden, an unemployed underclass that the struggling Lebanese economy just couldn't afford to support. The refugees were seen as outsiders, and over time, hostility grew. But the camps didn't just become places of suffering, they became fortresses of resistance. The PLO, which had been driven out of Jordan after Black September in 1970, relocated its entire base of operations to Lebanon. With Arafat in charge, the PLO turned these refugee camps into heavily armed fortresses, using them as launching points for attacks against Israel. Weapons were stockpiled inside the camps, new fighters were trained, and cross-border raids into Israel were launched from Lebanese soil. Lebanon, which had once been a relatively peaceful country, was now being dragged into the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and many Lebanese were furious. The PLO was acting as if it ruled the refugee camps, enforcing its own laws, running its own operations, and using Lebanon as a battleground for its war with Israel. The Lebanese government had no control over these areas, and this created growing tensions between Palestinians and the Lebanese army. And by the mid-1970s, those tensions would explode into a full-scale war. Many Christian political groups saw the PLO's presence in Lebanon as a direct threat to their survival. The most powerful of these groups, the Phalange, a right-wing Christian militia, declared war on the Palestinians. The spark that ignited the war came on April 13, 1975. That day, Phalange gunmen ambushed a bus carrying Palestinian fighters in Beirut, massacring everyone on board. That one attack triggered a full-scale war between Christian militias and Palestinian groups, plunging Lebanon into 15 years of bloodshed. Palestinians fought alongside Lebanese Muslim militias, but the war was chaotic, with shifting alliances, brutal massacres, and devastation on all sides. By the early 1980s, Lebanon had been completely destabilized, and that's when Israel made its move. Israel had been watching from the sidelines, waiting for an opportunity. With Lebanon now in chaos, they saw their chance to strike at the PLO directly. In 1982, Israel launched a full-scale invasion of Lebanon, with one goal, and that was to destroy the PLO once and for all. Israel forces swept across Lebanon, pushing into Beirut itself. During the invasion, one of the darkest chapters in Palestinian history unfolded, the Sabra and Shatila massacre. In September of 1982, Israeli forces allowed Christian militias to enter the Palestinian refugee camps of Sabra and Shatila. What followed was one of the worst atrocities in modern Middle Eastern history. Over 2,000 to 3,500 Palestinians were slaughtered, most of them civilians, men, women, and children. The massacre was carried out by Christian militias, but Israel was complicit, as they had surrounded the camps and allowed the killings to happen. This event cemented the deep Palestinian-Lebanese divide and further shattered any hope of stability for Palestinians in Lebanon. By the time the Lebanese civil war ended in 1990, Lebanon was in ruins. But the Palestinians were no closer to finding a home. The PLO had been expelled from Lebanon, relocating its base to Tunisia. The refugees remained, stateless and still living in the same camps they'd arrived in decades earlier. And the Lebanese government's stance never changed. Palestinians remained denied citizenship, denied basic rights, and denied any real future. Even today, Palestinians in Lebanon live as second-class citizens, locked out of many jobs, unable to own land, and still confined to the refugee camps their grandparents were forced into. Lebanon wasn't the only Arab country that turned its back on Palestinian refugees. South of the border, Egypt had taken in thousands of Palestinians after the wars of 1948 and 1967. But unlike Jordan, which at least gave them citizenship, Egypt made sure Palestinians would never truly belong. Unlike Lebanon, which kept them isolated in refugee camps, Egypt didn't even let them integrate into society. From the very beginning, Egypt's policy was clear. Palestinians were not welcome to stay. After the 1948 war, Israel took control of most of historic Palestine. But Gaza fell under Egyptian rule. Egypt had a choice. It could either annex Gaza, give its Palestinian residents citizenship and integrate them into Egyptian society, or it could treat Gaza as a separate, controlled zone, detached from Egypt itself. And Egypt chose the second option. For nearly 2 decades, Gaza was under strict Egyptian military rule. It wasn't treated like an extension of Egypt. It wasn't absorbed into the country. Instead, it was managed as an occupied territory, a place for Palestinians to remain trapped but not welcomed. The Egyptian government closed the borders, imposed harsh restrictions, and barred Palestinians from entering Egypt freely. They were not given Egyptian citizenship. They could not work or travel freely in Egypt. Even when they tried to escape to the Sinai, Egyptian border guards sent them back. While the world blamed Israel for Palestinian suffering, very few pointed out that Egypt was already treating Palestinians as outsiders long before the Israeli occupation of Gaza even began. It became crystal clear that Egypt saw Palestinians as a liability, because Egyptian leaders knew that integrating Palestinians into Egyptian society would bring instability. Refugees would bring their armed resistance, their nationalist movements, and their political factions, all of which could threaten Egypt's own government. That was a risk they weren't willing to take. Unlike Jordan, which absorbed Palestinians to strengthen its claims over the West Bank, Egypt had nothing to gain by taking them in. They didn't need more people, they didn't want more fighters, and they certainly didn't want to invite Palestinian political movements into their borders. That's why Egypt locked everyone in Gaza, keeping the situation contained but never resolved. By the 1960s, Egypt's president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, had become the face of Arab nationalism. He was the loudest voice against Israel and a vocal supporter of the Palestinian cause. He promised that Egypt would liberate Palestine and drive Israel into the sea. But behind the speeches, Nasser wasn't actually trying to solve the Palestinian crisis. He was just using it. He knew that as long as he kept the fight for Palestine alive, he could position himself as the undisputed leader of the Arab world. But then came 1967, and everything changed. Nasser miscalculated. He overestimated his military strength and underestimated Israel's response. In just 6 days, Israel crushed the Egyptian army, seized the entire Sinai Peninsula, and, most significantly, took Gaza from Egyptian control. The war was a disaster for Egypt. But for Palestinians in Gaza, it was the moment their fate changed forever. For the first time, Gaza was under Israeli occupation, not Egyptian rule. The same border restrictions and the same military control, but now with a different flag over their heads. But how did Egypt respond? Well, it washed its hands of Gaza entirely. You see, after losing Gaza, Egypt had a choice. Either take responsibility for the people they had controlled for 20 years, or pretend Gaza was never really their problem. And guess what? Egypt chose the second option. From that moment on, Egypt's border with Gaza became just as tightly controlled as Israel's. Even after Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, the Rafah border crossing, Gaza's only link to the outside world that wasn't controlled by Israel, remained under Egyptian control, and Egypt kept it shut for long periods of time. Even during times of war, when Israeli airstrikes were turning entire neighborhoods into rubble, Egypt refused to open its borders. Refugees who tried to flee across the Sinai were turned away at gunpoint. Humanitarian aid was restricted, and even temporary asylum was off the table. And this wasn't just about security. It was about policy. Egypt's government has never wanted a permanent Palestinian presence inside its borders. Even today, Palestinians in Gaza know that if they try to cross into Egypt, they won't be treated as brothers, they'll be treated as a problem. To make sure that the message was clear, Egypt literally built a wall. In 2008, when Palestinians in Gaza tried to break through the Egyptian border to escape Israel's blockade, Egypt's military rebuilt the border wall with reinforced steel, a 9-meter-high barrier designed to keep them in. In 2020, Egypt expanded its security zone along the border, even destroying entire neighborhoods on the Egyptian side of Rafah to make sure no Palestinians could sneak through. While the world criticizes Israel for its blockade, very few people talk about the fact that Egypt has had a blockade on Gaza for decades. This message from Egypt has remained the same since 1948, that they support Palestine, but only from a distance. With Egypt, Jordan, and Lebanon covered, there was only one group of Arab nations left, the Gulf states. We're talking about Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and the UAE, and their oil-rich neighbors. Unlike Egypt or Jordan, these nations were far from the battlefield. This meant that there was no need for refugee camps, nor did they face any border conflicts. And most importantly, there was no direct involvement in the wars. But what they did have was money. And a lot of it. And while the Gulf states never absorbed Palestinian refugees the way Jordan or Lebanon did, they found another way to benefit from them. They gave them jobs. For a while, it seemed like an arrangement that worked. But soon you'll see that that goodwill won't last. And when the time came, even the Gulf states would turn on the Palestinians, just as brutally as any other Arab nation did. So, after the 1948 war, most Palestinian refugees fled to neighboring Arab states. But after 1967, another wave of Palestinians left the refugee camps, not to seek asylum, but to find work. The Gulf states were booming. Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, the UAE, and Qatar were flush with oil money. Their economies were growing rapidly, but they needed a skilled workforce. At the time, Palestinians were among the most educated Arabs: teachers, engineers, doctors, accountants, and businessmen. And so, while the Gulf refused to take Palestinians as refugees, they welcomed them as workers. By the 1970s and 1980s, hundreds of thousands of Palestinians had settled in the Gulf, particularly in Kuwait and Saudi Arabia. In Kuwait, Palestinians became one of the most powerful communities, taking up major roles in business, education, and the oil industry. In Saudi Arabia, Palestinian professionals became teachers, engineers, and government advisors, helping modernize the kingdom. In the UAE and Qatar, Palestinian traders and businessmen helped build entire industries. And for a while, this arrangement worked. Palestinians sent money back home, funding their families in refugee camps. Their income helped sustain the Palestinian economy, especially in the West Bank and Gaza. Some even built entire businesses, becoming wealthy entrepreneurs. For the first time since 1948, it seemed like Palestinians had found a place where they could thrive, a place where they could build lives without being trapped in refugee camps. But there was a problem. No matter how successful they became, they were still just foreign workers. And the thing about being a guest worker is that you are only welcome as long as you're useful. The moment politics shifted, everything changed. The biggest betrayal came in 1991, after the Gulf War. At the time, Kuwait had over 400,000 Palestinians living and working there. They had been in the country for decades, helping build Kuwait into one of the richest nations in the world. Then, in 1990, Iraq invaded Kuwait. Saddam Hussein took over the country in a matter of days, and the world responded with the US-led Gulf War to drive him out. But here's where things took a disastrous turn for Palestinians. Yasser Arafat and the PLO made a fatal mistake. Instead of siding with Kuwait, the country where so many Palestinians lived, Arafat backed Saddam Hussein. It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Palestinians had nothing to do with the invasion, but because Arafat had sided with Iraq, Kuwait saw all Palestinians as traitors. And when the war ended in 1991, Kuwait retaliated with full force. Over 400,000 Palestinians were expelled. Their businesses were shut down overnight. Their bank accounts were frozen, and their assets were seized. Many had been in Kuwait for generations, but that didn't matter. In a matter of weeks, Palestinians in Kuwait went from being a thriving community to stateless refugees. And it wasn't just Kuwait. Saudi Arabia drastically reduced Palestinian employment. The UAE stopped issuing permanent residency permits to Palestinians. Other Gulf states quietly distanced themselves, ensuring that Palestinians would never be fully accepted. By now, the Gulf leader had seen what happened in Jordan and Lebanon when Palestinians became politically active, and they weren't going to let history repeat itself. Once again, the message was clear. You are not one of us. You are temporary, and you are someone else's problem. So when you put this all together, one fact becomes undeniable. No one in this world is ready to take the Palestinians. Not Jordan, not Lebanon, not Egypt, not the Gulf. And that is why Donald Trump is pressuring nations like Jordan and Egypt, warning them to either take in refugees or face repercussions. But even then, it's highly doubtful that anything meaningful will come out of this. At this point, Jordan and Egypt aren't just worried about taking in more refugees, they're worried about who might be hiding among them. Both nations have a deep distrust for Palestinian political groups, especially Hamas, the governing authority of Gaza. Jordan still remembers the Black September, and Egypt has battled Islamist insurgencies for years. Neither Jordan nor Egypt is willing to take that risk. And beyond security fears, there's the larger political game at play. If Egypt and Jordan take in Palestinian refugees, it gives Israel an excuse to never negotiate for a solution for Palestine. If Palestinians are resettled elsewhere, the idea of a Palestinian homeland fades even further into the books of history. So despite all the speeches, the protests, the flags, and the calls for justice, Arab nations have learned their lesson. This isn't about supporting Palestine anymore. This is about protecting their own countries from problems they've already faced before.